Let's take a look at how we respond to events and incidents right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello and welcome to HCI Learning. I'm your host, Zach Memis for NIST Cybersecurity and Risk Management Frameworks. And with me, as always, is our expert, Adam Gordon. Adam, how are you doing?
Doing good. How about you?
I can't talk today, Adam. I'm having trouble.
Well, at least I'm here. I can talk. So that's half of the dynamic duo, as we say.
It's how you respond, isn't it?
It is how you
And you know,
respond.
I would like to ask you, what are the details surrounding the respond function? Because that's where we're at now.
We are moving into the respond function, the fourth of our fifth overall functions in the CSF, and actually a very exciting one. They're all important, all exciting in their own ways. But when you look back over where we've been, identify, protect, detect, and now, of course, respond, we're moving into the phase, the function, where we actually can now take action if something is to occur. And we talked a lot, especially in our last conversations around the detect function, about understanding mechanisms, methodologies, approaches through continuous monitoring, logging in particular, and alerting that allow us to understand that something is going on, often something we refer to as being anomalous, something unusual perhaps that we haven't seen before, but certainly something that may require our attention, maybe of concern. And now that we've established that something is happening, right, whatever that something is, we now want to take some sort of action so that we can address that anomalous activity, confront it, and perhaps either mitigate it, minimize its impact in some way, perhaps acknowledge it, but say, you know what, not a big deal. We'll keep an eye on it, but not too important right now. We're not going to be overly concerned. And or we're going to take aggressive action to stop it in its tracks. Maybe it's an inbound denial or distributed denial of service attack, for instance, and we need to safeguard our systems by blocking all the inbound traffic from perhaps that entire IP range. And so our intrusion prevention system, our IPS, may slam down on top of those inbound IP addresses and block any of the ingress, the inbound traffic that is coming in against those targeted systems on the inside of our local area network. There's a variety of ways we could think about respond, but whatever it is at the end of the day, whatever it may be, I want to be thinking about taking action specifically tailored based on the output of what happens in the prior function, the detect function. We can't just randomly take action against any and everything, right? The concept of spray and pray that we use when we fire machine guns doesn't really add value here. We may hit something, we may not, but we're going to cause a lot of collateral damage right along the way, and we're not going to be very effective and targeted. We want to take concise, precise, well thought out actions in terms of responses. We want to take our time, know and understand to the best of our ability what the system or systems, there may be more than one, are affected that we think theoretically or actually we have proof of, have anomalous activity occurring based on the outputs of the detect function. And as a result, want to then target our actions specific to these particular phases. So it's going to be really a whole conversation, Zach, around those kinds of things.
Okay.
Those are the things that we want to be considering, at least at the high levels we get started.
What is the difference between events and incidents? Because I get confused about that.
So yeah, we've actually talked a bit about events in the last conversation we had around detect in the detect function. We called out the fact that events are things that happen, if you remember, right? And we talked about the fact that as events occur, they can certainly be, on occasion, hopefully a lot of occasions actually, they can be good. We also talked about the fact that they may also turn bad. And so events generically are really just things that occur. When we define, describe, categorize the idea of the event, and we give it some meaning, and we say, well, the fact that Zach logged in at 9 o'clock this morning on a normal business day from his normal machine in his normal way, using his username and password, and everything was good, and he was able to log on with no trouble, that is an event, but it's simply an event we want to take note of. It's a good event. We know Zach was successfully providing identifiers that allowed us to authenticate him and authorize him and track his activity. Sounds suspiciously like the IAAA thing that we might have talked about in the past. If he did that, then we would note that event, but it would be considered a good event. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We actually call that a successful logon. So we'd say it's a good event. But if the same thing happened and Zach was not able to log on successfully, maybe he just mistyped his password, no big deal. We'd say that's a failure because he was not able to log on successfully, and it is a negative event in the sense that it does not represent a successful logon. But we would not be overly concerned, Zach, about the fact that it was you and you just simply mistyped your password, because we know that happens on occasion. We've all been responsible for, and occasionally, right, the outcome has happened that we've forgotten our password and caused that event to occur. But Zach recovers, no problem, tries it again, gets back in, everything is good. We simply log the fact that he had a negative outcome on that one attempt, and we move on. No big deal. But what if it's not really Zach? What if it's actually somebody impersonating Zach, right? And perhaps it is Carola, our producer behind the camera for us on this episode, who is actually pretending to be Zach because she needs to log into his machine to get some information, and she thinks she knows his password, but she clearly tries and isn't successful. Well, that would be a little bit more concerning because we don't want someone impersonating somebody else. That's going to potentially lead to bad outcomes. So we would call that event that is negative, but actually is negative for a legitimately concerning reason, we will call that an adverse event, one that has negative consequences,
Right.
and perhaps even go so far as to say it could be a computer security incident, an event that has negative consequence that violates a policy or a practice in our organization. Now, it would obviously depend on several factors. Do we have a policy and or a practice that says, hey, we're not allowed to impersonate users for any reason? Well, then we would say that Carola's actions might actually rise to the level of a computer security. But if she did it without malice, without meaning to cause harm, she really just did it because somebody said, hey, I need this thing. And Zach said, I'm not going to be there, Carola. Would you mind taking care of it? You just log into my machine. And maybe she just forgets what the password is that he quickly said would be successful. And she tries, but really no harm comes from it at all. Everybody just had good intention. We'd say it's an adverse event. It doesn't have negative consequence really, but we want to log it as an inappropriate action because we want to note that someone else other than the intended owner of that machine and the intended authorized user really did actually have the opportunity to log in. So it's a question of categorization. It's really a question of degrees, if you will, Zach, when we think about events versus incidents. But events that have negative outcome or consequence, adverse events is what we call them. Events that rise to the level of violation of policy or practice, we label those computer security incidents. And that's how we distinguish between the two when you think about it. Now, when we think about events versus incidents, this kind of conversation, and by the way, gave you some examples of what each might actually be beyond someone logging in accidentally or purposely as somebody else, to give you a sense of what is adverse versus what is really a violation of policy. But when we think about it, if we do have an event that leads to some sort of negative consequence or a computer security incident occur, well, we have to do more than just say, oh, that's okay, we'll put it in the log and we'll take care of it later, right? We have to have an incident response plan. We have to have some kind of activity that we're going to bring to bear and execute on. It's going to allow us to establish beyond any reasonable doubt exactly what was Carola attempting to do. Why was she attempting to log in as Zach when we know she's not supposed to be? Are we really concerned, or was it legitimately, like I said, just a good effort on her part to help somebody out that just unfortunately didn't go the way that everybody thought it would? But we want to have an incident response and an incident response plan capability at our fingertips. It's one of those things we want to do proactively. We've talked a lot about the value of being able to think ahead of the logic of what may happen. When we're thinking about managing risk and managing change in an organization, we want to try. It's hard, and I understand that we can't anticipate everything. I talk about this with my customers, my clients, my students all the time. You've been doing this for a long time. How do you know what to plan for is what they often ask me when we're working together. Well, I can say based on all the years that I've been doing this, there are things that are very common, very likely to happen. It's likely that if you're in the East Coast of the United States between June and November, approximately, of any given year, right, that you're going to experience weather disruption events because of hurricanes or tropical storms or something like that. It's very likely that if you live in the northeast of the United States during the winter months of the year, you're likely to just, have weather disruption events due to snowstorms and things of that nature. We could reproduce that logic across the world by geography. And it's logical to say that given where you are in the industry you work in, that you should plan for those things because disruptions will occur. So, we have some things we know are going to happen. And then there are things that are perhaps not known, but we can often say, look, chances are we can anticipate that if we do this long enough and enough people become customers of ours and become successful enough, that it's possible that bad actors are going to take notice of us, our success, and want to come and try to take things away from us. So we should put firewalls in place to prevent inbound traffic from coming into our systems without being vetted, without being filtered in some way. We've talked in prior conversations about the value of using firewalls as a network protective measure, right? You think about it. We've talked about the fact that we might want to be putting in not just firewalls, but also logging. We've talked a lot about logging and the value of continuous monitoring and alerting. Talked about that as we mentioned and went through elements associated with the detect function. So we've had those conversations. So I tell my customers, it's stuff like that that I can anticipate and tell you about, but it's zero-day exploits, things that are not known to us currently that are going to happen, but we just don't know what they are. I can't anticipate those, but I can tell you that incident response and incident response planning can position us to be successful at addressing even zero-day exploits. And you have to listen carefully when I say this to understand what I mean. Not that we're going to mitigate the exploit because we know ahead of time what it is. It wouldn't be a zero-day exploit if we did, but rather that we could position ourselves holistically across the organization with good, solid planning, good, solid communication, broad and wide documentation made available to everybody. That culture of security we keep talking about and referring to, if we do that, and we publish our plan, an example of what a plan may look like is really just what that graphic represents on the right-hand side of the screen. We're going to walk through and take a look at some examples of plans in one of our conversations and show you in a little more detail what they may look like. But the reality is we want a list of actionable items. We want them prioritized and listed based on the execution order. That's what this graphic is meant to represent. And if we set our response strategy and plan, we establish our team, we communicate broadly who's on that team, make everybody aware of what to do, who to call, have a bunch of documents and checklists to drive all that activity, and we relentlessly practice all that ongoing. I promise my customers, my students, my clients, and I promise you, both as IT and audit professionals, so you can promise your customers and your clients as you go back and put this training to work for you and your organization, that the reality is, while we can't anticipate everything, we can understand how to be prepared regardless of what happens. Now, that's a broad catch-all statement. I understand certain things will happen we cannot prepare for. So big caveat there, a little asterisk, right? We know that. But I can tell you that with proper planning, even if we can't anticipate everything, we can mitigate, blunt, and minimize the impact that the unknown has because we know that we have a team of dedicated professionals who are prepared to act. We know we can bring them to bear as needed with the proper communication strategies because they're going to pay attention, and everybody has the proper documentation to drive our ability to begin assessing the situation and figure out what the logical next steps will be. That's what incident response is supposed to be about. It's not a plan that anticipates everything, because the minute you make a plan, it's obsolete the second that things don't go according to plan. And we know that most likely in most organizations on any given day, things happen that are not looked for and planned for. But that doesn't mean organizations stop functioning. It doesn't mean we stop doing business. It doesn't mean we, ultimately have to lose that battle. It could, don't get me wrong, it definitely could. But it doesn't mean we have to. It means what we have to do is keep our heads about us when all of the other stuff going on around us is seemingly chaotic. And if we can do that, we're then going to be able to turn and begin to understand how to engage. And by turning and engaging forcefully, successfully, and in an appropriate and thoughtful manner, we can drive incident response and make it something that ultimately, from our perspective, leads us to make better decisions and hopefully, as a result, find success. So I think it's important to bring all this together as part of the conversation, Zach, around how we respond, what those actions are, why incidents versus events are so important to distinguish around, because it's the incident, the thing that violates policy or process that we have to take more seriously, that we have to respond to in a thoughtful way, that really is the difference between success and failure when we think about risk mitigation.
But what is the incident response life cycle?
So the incident response life cycle comes to us actually from NIST. Shocking, because it's not like we've mentioned NIST before, in, I don't know, the last 5 minutes at least. But it comes to us, it does come up fairly often. Yep. It does come to us from NIST SP 800 61R2. the document specifically that lays out the incident response lifecycle for us, has this wonderful graphic that you see reproduced on the screen here in it, actually. And this is directly from the NIST document. So I encourage you, as we often do when we mention NIST documents, to use the resource list we provided for you. Go ahead and take a look at the document. You can always Google and find the document link and download it as well. Remember, all the NIST documents are freely available through NIST, so you don't have to pay to get them. You just have to take the time and trouble to go download them. But they should be part of your toolkit, not the toolkit we talked about for the case study. That's definitely going to be important, but this very specific set of documents we told you about for that. But I mean more broadly, as an IT professional, as an audit professional, as one or both, you should have these kinds of NIST documents readily at hand. You should have read them. You should be familiar with them. You should understand how to apply the guidance from them as part of your daily, weekly, monthly activities and practice, as well as in conversations with peers, with colleagues, with customers, because these are the documents that lay down the foundational guidance that we build our practice upon. And so the life cycle, to answer the question Zach posed to us directly, the incident response life cycle, is going to look just like this. Shocking, right? We start with preparation. Who would have thought we should prepare first before we do anything? But we prepare on the left-hand side of the graphic here. We then see the flow moving left to right from prepare into detect and analyze. Well, detection and analysis is something that we've already talked about as one of the prior phases or one of the prior areas that we focus on with regards to the functions in the CSF. We're coming out of the detect function, moving into response. We move from detect and analyze, and notice we kind of go up and arc over left to right over the top of detect and analyze, down towards containment, eradication, and recovery. And notice there is a cyclical arrow that goes clockwise below containment, eradication, and recovery, moving right to left, coming up towards detection and analysis, indicating we may have to do this more than once in an iterative loop in order to fully understand, right? Fully find all the things we have to detect and contain, eradicate. Go back, do we get it all, right? Oh, no, got to get some more. Let's go in and do it again. Eventually, we hopefully are successful and feel we can break out of that cycle. And we move out of containment and eradication, moving left to right, over to post-incident activity. This would be where we do a lessons learned, a post-implementation review. And notice from there, moving right to left, lower arcing arrow coming back towards me on the left side of our screen here. We come back to prepare because we always have to start at preparation as we continue this cycle. Because we were good with this incident. Thankfully, we got through it, put it to rest. But what about the next time? Well, maybe there's some lessons from this incident that we can apply that will make us successful at not only achieving this same outcome the next time, but what if it's slightly different? Well, we want to modify our approach and perhaps adjust it so that we can be better at detection and analysis, containment, eradication, and recovery, and ongoing preparation through lessons learned through a post-incident activity report is going to be very helpful here. So, Zach, a life cycle that we see based on how NIST provides that information to us. Really important for you to go take a look at it in the document and have the broader context of how it operates. But it is really going to be about that simple, ultimately, at the end of the day, if you think about it. Now, speaking of looking at documents, right, there are a couple of things you probably want to put on the table here, so to speak. See how I did that? Table
You
two,
did that very
right
well.
on the table. We're going to go take a look. And you've been with us in some of our prior conversations. And if you have been going through the functions with us up until now, you've seen us take a look at the NIST CSF document, look through one or more of the areas to describe the categories and subcategories. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to go take a look at table 2, look at the respond function. And when we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to bring it up right here, take a look. We're going to see that we're down around, I believe, page, let me just double check. I think it's page 41. Yes, it is page 41. So you'll see that, and we can take a look. It was on the screen a moment ago, but you can see right here, respond. And you'll see that we've got our categories, subcategories, our informative references, got a lot going on in here. We're not going to delve into all the intricacies of respond right now. We've got a lot of conversations coming up where we'll have the opportunity to look a little bit more in depth at some of the stuff in the table. But just at a high level, I wanted to lay out the fact we have response planning. We've talked a bit about that already. We have communications. We mentioned that in relation to knowing who to call, where they are, how they're going to be a part of the team, things of that nature. So we're going to definitely be circling back, talking a little bit about that. We have analysis. We spoke about understanding how to not only detect and analyze, but then ultimately eradicate, contain, and hopefully lessons learned after that. So we're going to have analysis, plays a big part. We're going to have mitigation. Mitigation is about that containment and eradication that we spoke about. And we're going to have improvements. That is our lessons learned. And we could see our last of the functions down there, recover, which at some point I'm sure we'll talk about. So we've got this whole set of conversations that we'll sprinkle liberally through some of the additional areas we want to cover with regards to the functions. But in addition to the NIST CSF document, we also spend time pretty consistently in all the functions looking at the NIST SP 853R5 document, the document that provides all the controls that we would likely want to access and attach. And there's no exception here. We do have some controls that may be valuable that we want to take a look at. We're going to take a look right down here. And let me come down to this area. It is alphabetized, as I remind you. Let me just highlight incident response while we're doing that before we zoom in. And we can see 3.8 incident response. So we're going to take a look at a series of controls in here that would speak to all the elements around response planning and incident response that might be helpful. And there's a long list of them. You could see not as many as in some areas, but still a good number. We have 8 overall. And as we zoom in, 9 overall rather. And as we zoom in, just see if I can bring that down so you can see that in focus. We have policy and procedures. We have incident response training and testing. We're going to speak about some of those things and how they come together. Very important elements. Incident handling, reporting, response assistance, the response plan. We've been talking a bit about response planning already. And information spillage response, meaning if we do have some sort of leak or a breach that involves information being out and confidentiality being compromised, let's say, how are we going to address that with a set of specific controls that may help us too? So we've got a lot of guidance going on the NIST side, both from the CSF as well as from SP 553R5, both of which should be thought of as good resource documents, and both of which we often speak about as being valuable for us that we should be leveraging, or at least trying to leverage, as we consider how we're going to apply guidance. So it's good to always put both out there and think about both.
So how can we try and bring all this information about, incident response together in a practical way? I'm going to use that term again, practical.
A practical, as in perhaps, I don't know, some hands-on things. Maybe an exercise, something we want to do. We got to get you a better code word to tee that up. I think everybody's beginning to know that's what we're talking about. All right, so Zach has asked the magic question with the magic words. How do we see how to apply this? How do we practically do this? Well, you know what that really means is that Zach came up with another great way for us to have an opportunity to do a little thinking and maybe use our workbook to jot down some ideas, answer some questions, and engage in some thoughtful observations about the discussions we've been having. How can they apply to you in your practice, what you're doing as an IT or an audit professional? We always take opportunities in many of our conversations to break away and offer you an opportunity like this because it's important to hear the conversation, but it's equally important to process it and put it into practice, and give you that opportunity through self-directed exercises, hopefully gives you that thoughtfulness necessary to do just that. So want to encourage you to take a look at this exercise. Think about clients that you have audited and or have been involved with as an IT professional, your own company, perhaps others. I gave you a timeline of the last year. That's flexible. It could be longer than a year, it could be less than a year. I just sat and thought about it when we were putting together the exercise, Zach and I said, well, how long would that really be? I mean, I could say just think about customers you've been involved with, but then you'd be like, well, for how long, right? Is that for my entire career? And I said, I could say, well, just in the last month, but what if you haven't been involved with anybody other than your organization? Or maybe you've been off and you haven't been at work the last month, right? So I said a year is probably a good timeline. So it's flexible. Achieve and anticipate, kind of think about it accordingly. But however you choose to look at that, we gave you 5 questions that hopefully are going to help you to not only think about and focus in on this, but to build some additional thoughts in you might not normally consider. How many of these, the customers you might have been involved with, had a global pandemic response plan before the outbreak of COVID-19 at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020? It's a very timely and relevant question, certainly. But the reality is most of my customers, with very few exceptions, did not have global pandemic plans in place prior to the advent of COVID. A few of them did. Some of them that were in the Middle East or in Asia, for instance, that were based there, had dealt with SARS several years prior. We had a very bad outbreak in that area of the world, more so in Asia than in the Middle East, although it affected both. Some of my customers in that region or those regions did have global pandemic planning because they'd been through one or more of these. But it's fair to say the majority of corporations globally really didn't have a thought process around what a global pandemic was, and as a result, how to deal with one. How many of them had this global response plan or have it now as a result of COVID-19? I find that while more of my customers, more of my clients More of my students, as I interact with them, are saying, yeah, we're starting to turn to think about this. I don't hear as much, yeah, we have one. I hear, well, we're thinking about whether we need one. And I think that conversation should be, we definitely need one, or hopefully we have one, or we're about to put it into action. Because events have shown we clearly are going to be dealing with this for some time to come, and this may not be the only one. And so we really have to think about that. Does your company, or a company, any company, but your company in particular, have adequate incident response planning in place for non-IT related incidents? A global pandemic is a non-IT related incident. Probably have good incident response planning around what happens when the servers go down and you have to restore them. But you may not have planning for what happens when we have a global pandemic. And evidence has shown that we were not prepared. Companies could not figure out how to get workers working remotely easily. We could not train students remotely easily. The whole world basically had to reinvent itself with regards to what we think of as normal. And that requires some thoughtful planning in order to accomplish. What would you recommend to a client concerned about incident response planning and how to undertake it? Lessons learned from your own experiences as well. And do you have a set of tools to help facilitate a conversation with a client about incident response planning? If not, what would you put on that list? Remember, we reproduce these questions for you in your workbook. So while I go through them with you on the screen here, help you to understand them, encourage you to answer them, you have them right in front of you following along with the workbook, and you can answer them at your leisure whenever you get around to it. But they're important questions not only for you to answer, but to take back to your company and engage in a dialogue with there, because especially the last few are going to be questions that may be hard to answer, but are important to discuss. So you want to think about that.
Excellent practical information. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for ACI Learning. I'm Zach Memis.
I'm Adam Gordon.
And we will see you again very soon.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.